For this section, there aren't any more exercises, so you don't have to sit next to random people. You can sit next to your co-founders again if you really want to, or you can sit next to your new friends who, you know, are going to be with you through this this whole incubator for 10 weeks or however long it lasts. Once we've got this map of ideas, actually, just before I get started on this, one thing I forgot to mention in the previous section is, so this personal business model canvas is kind of a map of your idea reach. When you go back to meet with your co-founders, you might have, hopefully you do have, very different business model canvases. And that's a really good thing, because it means that when you combine with your co-founders, you're going to find some really exciting new things that you can work on. It's worth going through the exercise yourself personally to map out what makes sense for you, and then going through the exercise as a group to go and figure out what makes sense for the group of you together. What are the really cool ideas that are within your reach? Or if you already have an idea that you're working on, what are the business models that really make sense for you as a group to implement this idea? But once you've got this model, or this set of models, what do you do from there? How many people here have heard of Lean Startup? Raise your hand. Most people. Do you know everything about Lean Startup? No. No? You've just heard about it? Have you read? How many people have read the Lean Startup book? Ah, a few people. Nice. Cool. It's a very, very well-informed group. Good. Well, I'm going to sort of take this a little bit to the basics. If I go too much into basics, feel free to tell me to yell and say, like, just go faster, and I'll zoom through all the slides. The first thing I'm going to do is sort of to try to really understand what this Lean Startup is about and why it's useful. So take a step back and think about what is a startup. There's been quite a lot of definitions and attempts at defining what a startup is. There's a dictionary definition, which is, as usual, completely useless. In any kind of specific fields, the dictionary generally doesn't really help that much. There's a sort of instinctive definition that people come up with, which is like startups are sort of fresh new companies that are there to do cool stuff. And it's slightly better than the dictionary definition, but it doesn't really provide much use still. Steve Blank, the guy who created the customer development methodology and who actually was Eric Ries's professor, Eric Ries being the guy who created Lean Startup, came up with this idea, which is quite good, is actually quite useful. The idea that a startup is an organization formed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. It actually says also it's a temporary organization. Eric Ries obviously has his definition of a startup. A startup is a human institution designed to deliver a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Paul Graham, founder of Y Combinator. Startup is a new business designed for scale, or a small company that takes on a hard technical problem. Each of those obviously is going to the definition from their own angle of what they want to achieve, what they want to explain. Of course, I couldn't resist. I came up with my definition as well. To me, a startup is a business. That means it needs to make money. That plans to grow by a large factor over the next few years. That has plans to do so. Everybody has a wish to go and grow by a large factor over the next few years. But if you're running a corner shop, for example, there's not much chance that you have plans to grow by a large factor unless you are really changing the way your business works. Anyway, so some of the key points that come out of these definitions are this idea of uncertainty, of search, of difficulty, the ambition, the drive to grow, the methods and the plan. So just wanting to grow is not enough. You have to have some kind of idea of how you're going to get there. It might be a wrong idea, but you have some idea about it. And importantly, the business and money aspect, which is something that Eric Ries, for example, in his definition, tried to get away from, because he wants everybody to apply Lean Startup everywhere. Whereas, as an entrepreneur myself, I feel that it's more useful to get back to the business side of things, which ultimately is about making money. So with this in mind, how should you build a startup? First, let's just cover quickly some typical approaches that don't work. One is the first write a business plan. That doesn't work because all it does is slow you down. You spend a few weeks writing a long document. We've already bashed the business plan enough today, so I'm not going to do it too much more. But that doesn't really make any progress on building a startup because you're just writing a bunch of wrong stuff on a piece of paper and it doesn't actually build anything. One approach, which is popular in theory anyway, is raise a lot of money and then figure it out. That kind of works in the Valley. It doesn't really work in the rest of the world. And in fact, for most people, I think raising money doesn't actually help you sort out building a startup. It actually hurts you because it provides you with a kind of cushion against reality. So that if you do get that $100,000 to not have to worry about money for a year, all that happens is that you spend a year, you spend $100,000, and then you're back to the same spot. So you've just wasted a year and spent $100,000 of somebody else's money and not actually made that much progress. Another approach that used to be very popular and is luckily becoming less popular is the idea that you plan your startup, you build it, and then people are going to come and use it. And even with some element of customer development, even with some input from customers, so even avoiding the really obvious mistake that I made with Vocalix, that still doesn't really work because of the very high levels of uncertainty of startups. Because you can't plan something when you don't know what you're supposed to be building. There's a really interesting expression that Eric Ries uses, which is achieving failure. So that's when you've got your plan for what you're going to build in your startup, you hit every single milestone on time, and then just after you've hit the last milestone, you go bust. Because nobody actually wanted that product, it was wrong in some fundamental way, and you only learn that at the end after achieving your entire plan. One model that does actually work, if you can manage it, is get lots of users and figure the rest out later. However, it's worth emphasizing just how hard it is to get lots of users, enough users that you really don't need to figure out the business model. These days, lots of users means upwards of 10 million active users. That's a lot of users. If you can manage to build something that has 10 million active monthly users, then probably you can figure out a way to make money from it. But that's really, really hard. So unless you're planning to get really good at driving growth of your product, this is not going to work for you, and you're going to have to figure out something better. Another approach, which actually is very popular these days, is just don't spend anything at all and just do the minimum, make the minimum investment into your startup and see how far you can get with zero investment. That approach is at least a bit more cautious. It's a bit less risky than just putting lots of money into something where you have no idea if it's going to work. But it's still not really the best thing, because not spending anything at all obviously slows you down. If you push this to the extremes, if there was a test that you could do that would teach you something useful about your startup, about your product, that would cost you $5, and you've got this mindset that you don't want to spend anything at all, you might not do that and not have that learning, not learn that lesson, and therefore not make the progress on your startup just because you're trying not to spend anything. This is where the lean approach comes in. And this is meant to be a better method. Eric Ries went and looked at a lot of startups that had succeeded or failed, and looked at the kind of lessons that experienced entrepreneurs have learned over the last decade of building startups, and kind of put this in a sort of cohesive package that he called the lean startup. One reason why this is so popular is because to experienced founders, it makes a lot of sense. People look at this and they're like, well, this matches with my experience. This seems like a very sensible method. It really does avoid a lot of the mistakes that I made. It certainly would have avoided most of the mistakes, all of the mistakes that we made in terms of the product on Vocalix and on Wubius. It's worth pointing out what lean is not. Lean doesn't mean cheap. There's a whole school of thought that misunderstands lean as meaning we don't spend any money, the sort of last point of the ways that don't work. If somebody says we're really lean, we don't pay any salaries, they don't know what lean means. Lean is not about not spending money. It's not a rigid methodology either. It's you have to tailor it to your specific circumstances. One of the most important things I learned in my time in Accenture, which is an organization that otherwise is very dogmatic and has a lot of methodologies, is they were very clear that the job of the project manager is not to just take the methodology and apply it blindly to the project, but to go and pick out the bits that work and think and use their brain and figure out what makes sense in this particular context. And lean is adaptable in this way. It's a very generic method that you can twist to fit your specific needs. It's not limited to simple ideas. This is something that you hear when you read about Lean online. One of the criticisms is that all you can do is really simple stuff that you can test with a landing page. But you can actually, the principle is so generic that you can use it in a lot of different contexts, including very complicated ideas. And in those complicated ideas, it will still save you a lot of effort, a lot of waste. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the magic key to success. There's no silver bullets. And this is not going to, just applying Lean is not going to suddenly result in your startup succeeding. It's just one of the tools that can help you along the way. What Lean is a method to organize the chaos, all these many ideas that are in front of you, all these many options. Try to sort of sift through them and figure out which ones work. It's a way to stop yourself from drowning as a startup in just too many different ideas that you could be working on. It's a way to reduce the waste, which we'll go back to in a second. It's a way to reduce the risk as well. If you can waste less money, there's also less risk that you're going to fail by running out of money. It's a way to increase the learning. That's probably the most important point that the Lean method tries to achieve, is to increase how much you learn during the startup. And it's also a common language. You've probably, if you guys have all heard about Lean, you've probably all heard about MVP and all sorts of concepts like that are connected to Lean. And having this common language helps you discuss your ideas. Just like knowing the business model canvas means that you can discuss your ideas more easily with people who are already familiar with the canvas. If you only take one idea from this presentation, please take this one, which is really the fundamental principle of Lean. It starts with the idea that people don't care about things they don't need or want. That is for sort of self-evident statement. If they don't care, if they don't need it, they don't want it, they're not going to care about it. Building things that people don't need is a waste, therefore, because nobody's going to care about it, you're not going to make money from it. By extension, building large things that people don't need is large waste. All still very obvious reasoning, I hope. But at the same time, because of the extreme levels of uncertainty involved in the startup, because of all this newness and all this obscurity around you, and because of your own lack of experience as well, if this is your first startup, the reality is you have no idea what you're doing. And therefore, you have absolutely no idea what to build. Because if you're honest with yourself, if you don't know anything, you don't know what people actually want, you're kind of like walking in a black room with no light and sort of trying to find the exit with no idea of where that exit might be. Might sound like a hard proposition, and it is hard. That is what makes startups difficult, is that you really don't know where to go. The consequence of that, one of the consequences of that is that probably many people will fail at their first startup, maybe even at their second startup, because it is quite hard. Hopefully, applying this Lean startup method will help you to reduce the failure rate, and maybe even succeed at your first startup, or at least fail in an interesting way. Basically, what you're trying to do with Lean Startup is hit this sentence, and hit in particular this word of the sentence, the probably. It's all about changing that probability and trying to get to the statement, to the opposite statement. So what the Lean approach is, fundamentally, is it's all about building the smallest, easiest, smartest thing that teaches you what you need to learn. So what we're doing is turning this sentence into this, into this, into this. So finding out the thing that you could build, or that you could do, build might even be the wrong word, that is probably not a waste of time at this point. This is kind of made of two statements. So first let's examine the second half of the statement. What do you need to learn? Well, there's usually three key questions with any kind of innovative startups. So as long as you're not doing a product that is already out there, that you already there is already a proven business model there, you'll want to ask yourself these questions. Do people want it? Does anybody actually care about this thing? Can you sell it? So do these people care enough to pay you, and can you actually reach the people who will be able to pay you? Can you reach enough of these people? There's a whole set of questions that fall underneath this heading. And then can you build it? And this kind of presents a very obvious starter plan of what questions you need to answer. Interestingly, one thing that people do usually is, especially if they're developers, is they put this question at the top and they start answering that one first by building the product. Whereas really what you want to do is order them in order of uncertainty and criticality. If you're a developer and you've come up with an idea, chances are you can build it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have thought of it. You're going to be able to get most of the way there anyway, unless it's a really, really crazy, technologically impossible thing. But then probably you wouldn't have thought of it. So what you want to focus on is the things that you don't know and resolve those first. Of course, this kind of sounds familiar. It's just a different perspective on something that we saw earlier today. This is another way to break down the questions by looking at different aspects of your business model. So what really is the key concept of the lean startup is basically it's a method to turn your business model into a series of questions and tests and experiments that you can go and figure out. Let's address the second part of the statement. Smallest, easiest, smartest thing. So many people here have heard of minimum viable product, I guess, MVP. Raise your hands. Everyone has heard of it. Brilliant. You will keep hearing about it probably on an almost daily basis for the next few years of your life, probably, which it gets very irritating after a while. But what is particularly irritating is that people kind of misunderstand what MVP is, because it sounds like just something that you build, the first version of the product. The minimum viable product is the smallest, easiest, smartest thing that teaches you what you need to learn. That is always the key thing. You need to be learning something from it. So examples of good minimum viable products are a landing page, for example. If you are trying to test whether people will actually buy your product, your online product, and it's something that you're selling online, like Basecamp, for example, and you want to see whether you can sell it, and that is your assumption that you're trying to test, then putting a landing page up with a buy button and seeing whether you can drive people there and they will click the buy button, even if it just gives an error afterwards, it will teach you something. It's easy, it's simple, you don't need to build the whole product behind it. If you can't get anybody to click the buy button, you're not going to get anybody to buy it after building it. This, the way that Eric Ries illustrates this is his last startup, which was called IMVU, was a kind of a chat system with 3D avatars. And they spent ages and ages building this integration piece to integrate with multiple chat networks. And then they realized nobody was actually downloading that thing. And the way Eric tells it is he thought about it and realized that if he'd just put a button to allow people to download this, he would have figured out just from people not clicking on that button that there was no need to spend 6 months building that piece of code. That was really hard and he was really proud of, but was completely useless and was very wasteful. Another type of MVP, which is very useful if you're in the B2B space, is a paper prototype. If you've got a product that you're trying to sell to businesses and you can't get them interested and wanting to have a go based on a paper prototype that you can sort of adjust and explain as you go along, chances are you're not going to get them interested in the full product either. So there's really no need to go and build an entire full product suite to show to business customers when you can just show them a bunch of PowerPoints and do the switching in front of them and see whether they're interested. Again, for business-to-business companies, a presentation or a pitch can be a good test, a good MVP. If you can't get to present your startup, chances are you're not going to be able to present it to sell it either. But you don't need to actually build it to find out that you can't get to your users. One that's been very popular is also the fake demo video. You've probably seen quite a few of those online where you've got a landing page basically plus a fake product video. that tries to get people interested. Dropbox famously did that, where the founder of Dropbox put together a video that basically showed that you put the file in the folder and it appears in the other folder within a few seconds. And put that on Hacker News, had lots of interest. Everybody wanted to know where they could get that because it looked like magic. So you knew that, well, now I just need to actually build the thing. People clearly want this. Another really interesting type of MVP is the concierge MVP. This is where you go and you might be aiming to create a product that is entirely automated, but you first run it manually. The example Eric Ries gives is of a startup that helps people to match discounts at local grocery stores with recipes that they might want to cook. And it will tell them, well, if you buy these 5 things that are half price at your local store, then you can cook this. And that way that will save you money and you'll get a nice meal out of it. And a nice variety of meals as well. And if you were to think about how to build this startup without using a lean approach, you might think, okay, so you're going to need to integrate with the database at all the grocery stores. You're going to have a lot of users to go and start testing this product. You're going to need to build all these algorithms to match the ingredients to the recipes. There's all sorts of massive pieces of work that can happen there. So what they did, which was really clever, was they just went to one local supermarket and stood there and talked to everybody they could talk to until they found one person who's willing to have them do that manually for them. This really simplified the problem because it meant they only needed to deal with one store. They could walk there and go and find out what's on discount. And they basically delivered the service manually for something like $11 a week or something. They would go to the store, find out what is the cheapest stuff, go to the person, show them the recipes, and deliver this service manually. And once they had figured out how to please that one person, they figured out how to add another and another, and progressively how to automate the service so that it would function at scale. But first they closed that loop, what I mentioned on the first day, and then they went and started to scale it. It's actually very similar to how Paulina and I built Grandtree, because we also closed the loop first and then built all the processes behind it. So in essence, a good MVP is anything that teaches you, that enables you to learn. That is what an MVP is. An MVP is not, and this is one of the most common misunderstandings, not a shitty version of the product. You get so many people who say, yeah, we went and we got somebody to build our MVP. That doesn't even start to make sense. The MVP is the next thing that enables you to learn. And it's not a product, it doesn't have to be the full product. In fact, if it's the full product, you're probably doing it wrong. So an MVP is driven by the questions that you need answered. That is the key driver of what is the next step, the next minimum viable product, the next minimum viable step. And for that, we turn to this important principle, which I've been actually talking about for 20 minutes now, which is the lean cycle. This is the fundamental idea of the lean startup. If you take only one idea, it's this one. Instead of having a linear process where you start with an idea and then you plan how you're going to build it, and then you build it, and then you deliver it to users, and then you fail, instead have a circular process where the progress is defined by how many times you go through the loop. The process starts probably with an idea. Then you build something. It might be a paper prototype. It might be a phone call. It's something that you do. This is the outcome of it. Out of having done this thing, you measure some kind of outcome. From this outcome, you get data. And then you learn from that data. And that informs the next idea that you have, the next bit that you want to test. And you keep going through the loop. The way Eric Ries puts it is that the progress of a startup, and this is a very sensible way to put it, the progress of a startup is measured by how many times you go through this loop. Not by how many milestones you achieve on your build plan, but by how many things you've learned. And the reason why, for example, a company like Nokia, which has basically a dying business model, is struggling to evolve, even though they have so much resources, is because for a company like Nokia to go through this loop just once costs billions of dollars. But as a startup, your advantage, especially before you even take any funding, before you have any employees, is you can spin through that loop very cheaply, very quickly. And you can learn very, very quickly what works. That is your key advantage, that's what you want to use. How do you actually go through that loop? Well, actually, funnily enough, you'd go backwards. You start with a hypothesis of what you want to learn, what you want to test. You figure out what metric you need in order to be able to learn that. And then from that comes out an experiment. And then that's what you build, and you go through the loop. You go and learn, and you figure out, okay, the next hypothesis that I need to test is this one, therefore I need this metric, therefore I need this experiment. Does that make sense so far? Yes. Do you have any questions about this at this point? No?
Could you perhaps give us an example for this loop?
Okay.
Perhaps you're wrong start with some other. I mean, I get it, but I guess that's
okay. Well, so this can happen both online and offline. So lean startup is often applied to online startups, but it works just as well offline. One example would be for Wubius. One thing we could have done, which we didn't do, which was a mistake, is one of our key hypotheses was that architects were willing to pay money, good money, for the product that we were building. So the hypothesis is people are willing to pay money for this product. Architects are willing to pay money for this product. The metric for that is, well, are they? You know, can we convince an architect to pay good money for this? So the experiment for that is pretty obvious. Call up some architects and try and sell it to them, and see if you can convince them on the promise to go and commit to buying this. If you can't, if we had called a bunch of architects and said, we want to sell you this product that costs £100 a month, and they'd all said no, well, we've learned at that point that, well, this hypothesis is clearly wrong. Most architects will not pay £100 a month for anything. We've tried to convince them, we've tried to cajole them, we've tried to paint this rosiest of products, and they still don't want to pay. Therefore, they're probably not going to pay when they see a product with warts and everything.
What would the conversation with them look? Would you tell them what are the benefits and what are the features of the product, and that's
So it's if you try to just hard sell the product when you're still very early, you're going to hit some problems there, which is people don't want to talk to salespeople. What makes more sense is usually to start the conversation by talking about their problems. So engage people by saying, I'm a founder working in this space, I'm trying to solve the problems here. Can I get some of your time to see if I could build something that would help you? And some people will say no, because they're really busy, or they don't care, or they're just mean. Some people will say yes, and you get some conversations. If you get no conversations, that's an answer already. Because if you can't get conversations with this method, you definitely can't get conversations when you're trying to sell your product. So, for example, if you were trying to sell something where you have to talk to the CEOs of multinational chemical companies, let's say, well, chances are you're not going to get those meetings, and you're going to find out pretty quickly, without having to build any kind of product there, that you just can't get to those people, and so the product doesn't work. You can't make that hypothesis true.
I ask you just one question?
Yeah?
How many attempts you can make for experimenting, like to get an answer out of trying to, like what Kasha said, like you try to call a few architects, and let's say like, they didn't want it, so although it's maybe a global product, so you can maybe reach some other architects from other countries, so just an average attempt that you need to take on?
There is no rule of thumb there. Basically, you'll do it as many times as you think it makes sense. As I said earlier, it's all down to you how you apply the methodology, and it's one of the decisions that is down to you. Ultimately, you're going to be convinced that this hypothesis is wrong when you're convinced. It might take 10 calls. It might be so hostile to you that 10 calls is enough, and you say, like, you know what, clearly these guys really don't want this stuff, I'm never going to sell anything to them. It might take just 5 calls. It might take 50 calls before you convince yourself. That depends on you and your view of reality and what convinces you. Yeah?
This phase of experimenting, does research help? Like, parallelly advertising, when you're trying to reach something that you don't know, I'm asking is, can research in that respect, like customer behavior,
Mhm.
that field, or some other accessible data,
Mhm.
maybe that research, keywords are being popular in that field, is the field itself popular?
Mhm.
Can that help us with the, a little bit,
Mhm.
a little bit closer to the answer?
And could you please repeat the question?
Yes, of course. So the question is, can research help? Can research about the market help to answer those questions? Yes, it can, but it's not a decisive answer. It's not a conclusive answer. There's the very well-known quote by Ford that if he'd asked people what they wanted, they'd have said a faster horse. The iPods, the iPhone, all that stuff would never have come out of market research. Ultimately, what you want to know is not what people say they want, is what they actually want. And the best way to measure that is to measure actual behavior. So if you can get people on that landing page to click on the buy button, enter their credit card details, and press purchase, you've learned something that no amount of asking them, would you buy this product, will ever tell you. Any other questions about this at this point? One thing worth adding is, where do these hypotheses come from? It should be obvious by now, because we've been spending all morning, all afternoon, coming up with hypotheses on these business model canvases. But basically, once you've got this wall covered with lots of different possible canvases for your startup, each of those is a set of hypotheses, a set of assumptions that's tied to that particular model. And so the ones that the place where you get those hypotheses to test is those canvases that you've designed. How to order those hypotheses? Usually you want to test, as I mentioned earlier, the most critical hypotheses first, because they're the ones that are most likely to kill you. So if the one thing you don't know is whether you can get in front of, I don't know, automakers around Europe, that might be the first assumption that you test, because that's a dependency of your business model. Okay, this is the most important thing of the lean startup. If you forget everything else I say after this, that's fine. The rest of the stuff is just a kind of whirlwind overview of a number of tools and techniques that are useful out of the so-called lean toolkit. First thing I'm going to talk about is metrics. Can anybody tell me what this graph conveys? Yeah, increase of users during the period of time. That's pretty much it. Basically says, yeah, user numbers are going up. Doesn't say why. Doesn't say what we've done to make that happen. Doesn't say whether we've done anything to make that happen. Could just be random users arriving there and signing up. Who knows? This is actually a graph from Wubius. These are authentic graphs that were used in a real startup, in real pitches to customers. It also tells you that if you angle the graph just right, it looks like it's exponential. It's a really useful lesson. This is the same graph a little bit later, and a year later. It continues to go up. Excellent. Good news. Startup is doing well. This is a variation on the same graph. This one is about number of projects. Again, it looks exponential. This one is a little bit more truthful because it's not angled in a funny way. But still, you can't really tell anything from that. This is a slightly more, a quite more truthful graph, which actually looks at the weekly average number of daily active users. This one we had to be a bit more truthful because this was for an investor pack. So they were going to ask questions and stuff, so we had to be a bit more forthcoming with the data. It's still a completely useless graph, but it looks a bit more useful because at least you're learning something that really has a bit more of an impact, whereas user numbers is so vague that there's not even a meaning attached to that. What none of these graphs tell you is that somewhere around here, I think, the business went bust. And we had to basically all go and move on to do other things. And the lesson here is that in every startup, it doesn't matter how badly the startup is going, people, like maybe the founders are sick in hospital, nobody's working on it, there's no customers, nothing is going right. You can always find at least one graph that goes up and to the right and looks good. So the lesson there is don't watch those graphs because they're useless. They don't teach you anything. These are the so-called vanity metrics. Things like user signups. So long as you're driving some users to your startup, you're always going to get an increase in user signups. Traffic, well, very often traffic will be increasing. Sometimes it will be decreasing. But the fact that traffic is increasing or decreasing doesn't tell you anything that useful. Even things that sound more useful, like retention rate, is actually useless as long as it's in a vacuum. What you want is metrics that actually are actionable and related to hypotheses. Stuff like A/B test results that are linked to one of your hypotheses, that is a good metric that is worth measuring. Stuff like cohort breakdowns cohort breakdowns are when you group users by when they signed up, and you look at various characteristics of those groups of users to see why, how long they're staying, what kind of activities they're doing. And if you tie that to specific changes that you've made, you might get some kind of idea about how the changes you're making are influencing the product, and therefore how useful they are and whether you should continue making those kinds of changes. Retention rates over time. Activity streams are one which is often discounted early on, but it's actually a very useful actionable metric, even though you can't really do statistical analysis over it. In an early startup, there's nothing more useful than just looking through what people have actually done, every click they've made, every page they visited, and trying to figure out what they were thinking when they went through that and where they got stuck, where they stopped. This is not something you can make an A/B test around, but it's very insightful if you go and take the time to record these. But the key is actionable. So what is actionable? Well, actionable means that it's related to a hypothesis, which generally means that it's going to be related to one of the key engines of your business. These engines are the engine of value and growth. It's another concept from the lean startup. There's two kind of parts to the startup. The first one is the engine of value, which is about how much value your startup is delivering. Is it actually worth something? Is it worth something to anybody, to the users? And it's important to nail that, because if you had, for example, as the extreme example, you have a great engine of growth, it goes viral, it hits everybody within the space of a day, everybody in the world, but it's completely useless. It wasn't worth hitting everybody in the space of a day if it's completely useless. You need to deliver some value, but you also need to deliver some growth. And then the question is, how does your startup acquire new customers? Now, for engine of value, you have some obvious metrics, which is whether people are willing to pay for it, how long they stick to using it. There's things that you're going to come up with to do with the value of your startup. For engine of growth, it really depends on how your startup acquires new customers. There's three main methods outlined in the Lean Startup book: paid, viral, and sticky. Paid is obvious. You pay money to people, to websites, whatever, to adverts, to get users to come to your website or to talk to you, or for you to talk to them. And you convert some amount of them into business, and hopefully you get more value out of them than you have to spend. So therefore, the first one, the key metrics that everything is going to drive down to, that are going to be the really actionable ones that you want to increase, you want to show that everything you do increases as metrics, are going to be the cost of acquisition of customers and the lifetime value of the customers. If you have a business where the lifetime value is bigger than the cost of acquisition, you've got a business that can scale. It might be difficult to scale, it might take a lot of money. If it costs $500 to acquire a customer and you make $600 from them, it's a relatively low margin business, and it might take a lot of those $500 to build up the machine. So then you might want to, for example, raise some money to accelerate that process. But it is already a scalable business. You've already achieved a scalable business if you've got those numbers to be in the right way. Viral is one that's often completely misunderstood. There are a lot of people think that they can make their product viral by just sticking a share button and having people share it on Facebook and Twitter and whatever, and they think, okay, the product's going to go viral. Viral means that the product spreads through the use of the product. If you have to share it actively on Twitter, it's not viral, it's word of mouth. Now, word of mouth can be very powerful, and it can drive a lot of traffic to you, but it's not viral. A good example of a viral product is PayPal. If you want to send money to somebody via PayPal, you send the money to their email address, they receive an email, they have to sign up to get their money out. Through the normal use of the product, the product naturally expands and drags more users in and grows. And if you're going to do a viral product, if your engine of growth is going to be viral, then you need to make sure that it's built into the product and that you measure that viral coefficient, that everything that you do around the engine of growth increases that viral coefficient and also the speed at which you go through that loop. The third one, which is a slightly more rare and more interesting one, is the sticky model, which is a very slow-burning and difficult model, but it works in some markets. The idea there is that you have a product that is such that when people sign up for it, they'll never quit after they sign up. One really good example of that is Skype. Once you've signed up to Skype, you're going to be a Skype user for the next, well, I mean, I can't remember when I signed up to Skype, probably 15 years ago, or God knows, whenever they came out. And I'm still a user of Skype. I've paid them some money occasionally, but they haven't had to pay any money to retain me. And if you have a sticky model, then you want the metric you want to, so if your business model depends on a sticky growth model, then you want to make sure that your retention rate is very high. And then you can acquire users relatively slowly or push some money into it to pump more users into it. But the point is, as long as you keep those users forever, pretty much, you're going to figure out some way to squeeze some money out of them through the engine of value.
What's
Yeah?
a high retention rate?
Sorry?
What's a high retention rate?
For sticky, you want the retention rate to be pretty much 100% or as close to 100% as you can. If it's lower than 100%, or like 99.9 or something, then your user base is going to decrease over time. You're going to have to keep pushing more users into it to make it go up again. Chances are you're going to pay money for that. So really, you might not be in the sticky model. You might be in the paid model. Yeah?
Can you tell me what is lifetime value?
So the lifetime value is the total amount of money that you're going to get out of the customer. So, for example, you might have an obvious example. Somebody signs up to Basecamp. Let's say that the average person keeps using Basecamp for 24 months. They pay $10 a month, I'm making this up, for 24 months. The average the customer lifetime value of the average customer would be about $240. So if Basecamp is spending more than $240 to acquire the average customer, they're losing money. If they're spending less, they're gaining money. Does that make sense? So, actionable metrics are the ones which lead to a change which you know will impact those key drivers. So either the value of your product or the engine of growth, the way you acquire, the way you grow that user base. There's an interesting quote there, which I really like, which is that if you simply plan on seeing what happens, instead of trying to test something and trying to have some kind of actionable outcome, you always succeed in seeing what happens. So never go and push out the change and say, oh, let's push this out and see what happens. Because you're not going to learn anything from there and you've just missed an opportunity to learn. For example, if you've got a change where you know that it's going to be useful and people are going to love it and they're going to use it, well, especially if you think that you really know that it's going to be useful, push it to half the users. See whether it makes any difference to your key drivers. Whether it makes any difference to your lifetime value, the cost of acquisition, or whichever metrics actually make sense for you. Another version of this quote is, if you can't fail, you can't learn. Everything you do should be, until you reach that product market fit and you've got that scalable engine that you can start to get going and scale up, everything you do should be about learning. And if you design an experiment where you can't fail, you won't be able to learn. It's a bit like the scientific method, where the only valid scientific hypotheses are falsifiable hypotheses, where you can prove it wrong. And if you can't prove it wrong, then it's not considered scientific. Well, similarly, everything that you do should have, in that hypothesis, metric, experiment loop, you should think about how you can prove it wrong as well, not just how you can prove it right. Another really useful concept of lean startup is this idea of innovation accounting. This comes up because if you're reporting your progress to either investors, if you have investors, or to your own employees or to your co-founder or to yourself even. It can be very depressing to have this lengthy period where it's basically flat and it's not really growing very much. And you need to have some kind of way to measure your progress. As we saw, the lean startup is about learning, not about growing the user base. So what the lean reporting, the innovation accounting method suggests is rather than report usage and revenue, which you may report anyway, go and report something else as well, which is to track those validated learnings. Track those experiments, like list them, say, be able to have this conversation with investors, advisors, colleagues, etc., saying, well, that week we measured these things and we learned this. That week we measured this thing and we learned this. And each time you might have a sort of slightly tweaked version of your business model that says, okay, well, because we learned this, we tweak things in this way. Or when we did this, we figured out how to increase that metric by this much. If you get in the habit of reporting this, it makes a much more convincing pitch as well to investors. So if you do get to the point where your business does require a cash injection and it is ready for it, so it's kind of a provable model and you can credibly make the pitch to an investor that all you need to do is put more money in this end and lots of money will come out the other end, that would be a lot more believable if you can also show them a kind of chart of this history of your startup and take them through each of the inflection points and say, this inflection happened because we tested this and we learned that, and therefore we did this, and therefore the user numbers jumped by this much, and so on. Pivots, another hot buzzword that you're going to get very tired of very quickly if you're not already. Pivots are what happens, what you do when an experiment has failed, or a fundamental experiment has failed. If you're just testing whether this new feature idea that you had could increase user numbers a little bit, that might not be time for a pivot. But if you are testing whether the army wanted to buy your hero rats and the response was that they don't want anything to do with rats, then it's time to pivot your model because that one is clearly not going to work. The questions you want to ask yourself when a fundamental experiment like that has failed is, why did it fail? Which of the assumption was wrong? Which business models are left on that wall of yours? Which ones are still valid? Which options are possible? Can the assumption be tweaked, or does it need to be just completely thrown out? Can you rework the business model now that you know this? The other situation where you might do a pivot is when the experiment has succeeded, but you've kind of been making steady improvements to the product, following this business model that looked like it worked, but you're starting to get diminishing returns, and maybe it's heading somewhere, it's heading for a stable position, but this position is not actually good enough to build a sustainable business. For example, you might have a product that you are selling, people are paying you money, but and you have proven that people do want to buy it and everything, but somehow, even though you keep improving all the metrics as much as you can, the revenue, the number of users kind of plateauing somewhere, and you've tried all sorts of ways to change this, and you can't quite figure out a way to expand the user numbers past this point. At that point, it's time to think about making a pivot. Now, how do you know if it's working well enough, and then you don't need to pivot? Well, it's a very simple test. If you're asking yourself if it's working well enough, it's not. That's it. Because when it's working well enough, you know. There's no doubt. There's a night and day difference between a business that's working, that's generating cash, that's like growing. There's so much excitement that comes into it. You see the growth is really palpable. When you're in a business that's not succeeding, by contrast, you're sitting there asking yourself, well, is it really working? Should I be changing something? You've got that uncertainty. And the uncertainty itself is a pretty strong sign that it's not working well enough. So let's take a little while to just go through some kinds of pivots that are valid pivots, that are not just, I'm bored of this idea, let's do something else, which is something that unfortunately happens a lot in the startup scene, at least in England, and certainly in Silicon Valley, where they'll change their mind about the idea and they'll say, oh, we're pivoting from a chat tool to a B2B logistics solution or something, which is not a pivot at all. It's just a complete throw away the old idea and start something new. One of the possible types of pivots is a zoom-in pivot. So you might figure out that actually one feature that you had built as part of an overall suite of features is enough to sell the product, or is a better way to sell the product. You might zoom into that single feature, or conversely, you might zoom out and make a larger product around that feature. That is the kind of pivot we were. So we are in the middle of doing a pivot that was a bit like this in Wubius when it went bust. We're actually doing two pivots at the same time, really, because we're also pivoting the customer segment, where we found that some customers like us, but not the ones that we initially targeted, or some customers are willing to pay, but not the ones initially targeted. Typically, you should try to limit yourself to one pivot at a time, by the way. So that was not really a great idea to pivot market and feature at the same time, but it can happen that there's two bits of pivot that are linked. It could be that you want to keep solving the problem for that particular customer segment, but that particular problem that you're solving is not enough, is not important enough for them to pay you. So you might change which customer needs you're fulfilling. We could have done that with Wubius, didn't. Another thing you might do, which is less common, but is also possible, is to switch the business architecture. Now, there's usually two major categories of businesses, and there's kind of hybrids in the middle, but usually two major categories. There's the low margin, high volume businesses, where you're selling lots of things to lots of people and you're making a small amount of money across lots of customers. And there's the high margin, low volume types of businesses, where you're not having so many customers, but each customer is worth a lot of money to you. It's easy to get stuck into one of those and not consider the other. But for example, Wubius, that might have been something that we might have considered, except it wouldn't even have worked with the architect, I suppose. We were trying to build a product that was meant to be a mass market for the architects. We could have gone and said, well, actually, let's focus just on the top architecture practices and build a product for them, and then expand downwards. That would have been a possible approach. Value capture pivot is obviously changing the way that you make money from your product, changing the revenue model. But don't abuse pivots. So, as I said, a pivot is not a response to, I'm kind of bored of this idea, it's not really working out, let's do something else. It's a response to a deliberate effort of learning things that teaches you that actually your idea didn't work for some reason. I'm going to go into the recap. So does anybody have any questions at this point about this set of tools? I've given a kind of flying overview of these things. There's no way I can go into full depth about how to use them and everything. That's going to come with experience and from reading lots more blog posts and stuff and trying them out for yourself. Anybody have any questions at this point? Yeah?
Regarding customer lifetime value, I just wanted to ask you, there is no way to calculate or estimate that value unless you are, let's say, 2 years giving the service to the customer.
Well,
2 years should be too big.
Okay, so the question is there any way to estimate the lifetime value of the customer until you've been going for a couple of years? Well, there actually is, because what you'll find when you run, put this here, when you run a web-based startup, is your retention rate is going to be less than 100% right away, unless you have a sticky model. So you'll be losing, say, 10% of your users every month, or some percentage. And from that retention rate, you can come to an early estimate of what the lifetime value is. The retention rate will go up and down, but it's remarkably steady, surprisingly so. So right away, you start to lose users at a steady pace, and they keep on losing at a relatively steady pace.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Anyone else? No? Okay. So I'm going to go into a massive recap of everything we've covered in the last 3 days. That's going to be pretty awesome. I'll start with what we covered today. So we looked at the business model canvas. Hopefully you learned how to use a new tool that you can use to map your own ideas, map other people's ideas as well. One really useful tool use for this is when you're mentoring or when you're giving advice to somebody else. What you find is very often if you try to just tell them about their idea, it feels very sort of accusing, and people don't like to be told negative things about their idea. But if you go and you grab a piece of paper, you draw a canvas, and as they explain their idea to you, you put down the key boxes there, and then you start talking about that piece of paper, about the model on the piece of paper, suddenly the conversation turns constructive. People don't feel like you're accusing them so much. We've hopefully learned that it's important to come up with many different variants of the idea rather than settle down on the first one that looks like it might work. To have all these options at hand so that when you prove that one doesn't work, you have the next one to work on. We've learned that startups are experiments, that you should test critical things as quickly as possible. We've learned probably the most important concept of the lean startup, this idea of going through this loop as many times as you can, of coming up with hypotheses, metrics, and experiments. We've learned to focus on actionable metrics, not vanity metrics. We've learned to report on learning progress rather than reporting just on vanity metrics, basically. To pivot when assumptions are wrong. Actually, this is not the huge recap right now. This is a small recap. There's a bigger one afterwards. What to do from here? Obviously, be smart in how you apply this stuff. There's no dogma in the world of startups. Things keep changing. These are just tools at your disposal. You need to decide how you're going to use them in your specific context. Do get advice, though. As I said on the very first day, it's important you know where the person who's giving you advice is coming from, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't get advice. Getting advice from somebody who ideally is a few years further than you are, who has built a startup in the last 3-4 years or something. If you're just getting started, if you have somebody who's just been through that a few years ago, they can save you a lot of errors, a lot of mistakes. And very importantly, do things. There's no point in sitting there and dreaming about lean startup methodologies and business model canvases. You have to actually go out there and try to make these things happen and resolve these hypotheses. So where to go from there? Where to go from here in terms of this lean startup? There's a bunch of books about both customer development and lean startup you might want to read. I think these slides will be online, so you can pick up this list there. There's numerous blogs about lean startups. There's mentors, probably not many in Serbia. We'll get there. You can get in touch with people like me, people who have blogs and stuff. They usually respond to emails if they're not too busy. If they are, just email them again and again until they respond. It works. People don't really get that annoyed so long as you ask intelligent questions. They'll actually just feel guilty that they didn't answer the first time. But what usually happens is that you get so busy that you just don't have the time to respond to stuff that takes time to answer. So you need people to make you feel guilty before you go and answer them. And get experience. The one way I like to put it is that lean startup method is a lot like the scientific method. It's completely useless unless you actually have the experience to go with it. If you were to give the scientific method to somebody who's not a trained scientist, all you'll get is a crackpot, because they'll come up with all these crazy theories. They won't know how to use the scientific method properly. That's why it usually takes 10 years of studying, of being taught how to use this method before a scientist who can actually competently do science comes out. Luckily, entrepreneurship is a bit easier than high-energy particle physics. So in my experience, it takes about 3 years rather than 10 years. Still, you need to go and get started, get those flight hours, get that experience. Now we're going to the big recap. So starting from the first day. So we addressed this metaphor of jumping out of a plane, hopefully conclusively. We learned to see entrepreneurship as a career that consists of finding those gaps, finding those opportunities, and fulfilling them. We talked about what are good ideas and bad ideas, and how to improve the process of coming up with this initial spark that is probably going to go into your initial business model canvas and help determine what sort of idea you want to work on. We've looked at why waiting for money to bridge that gap is not necessarily the best approach. That instead, as we've seen today with the MVP, there are ways to go and cut down that idea into a small thing that you can do right away to start proving whether it works. We talked about co-founders and how it's a lot like marriage and how it can go wrong, a lot like marriage. We've looked at alternative ways to motivate employees and even yourselves. Make sure that your own role is motivating to yourself, otherwise, you're not going to be working that long on your own startup. And today we looked at the business model canvas, the idea that you should come up with many different versions, the lean cycle, and that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah,
Last.
can you give us about pivoting?
Yeah?
Can you give us like off the top of your head an example of a startup that did really great after making maybe even a geometric pivot or a series of?
So can I give an example of a startup that did great after?
Monsters, I think, Daniel. They lost a massive amount of money washing monsters.
Maybe you want to give the example.
I don't remember the story.
I don't know enough about Martian Monsters either. So the question was, can I give an example of a startup that did great after doing a series of dramatic pivots, or at least one dramatic pivot? Well, one startup that is, let me think. Actually, that's a very good question. I don't have any examples off the top of my head right now, but I'll think about one and I'll get back to you after this. I mean, every startup does pivots, but the thing is you typically don't hear about them before they've actually succeeded. So by the time you hear about them, they've already finished pivoting. Actually, one example where, as far as I know, they did do a lot of changes. Yeah, there you go. I've got two examples for you. One of them is Instagram. They started as something called Bourbon, and they slowly evolved it and pivoted it and changed fundamental aspects of the product until they got to this sort of simple idea of sharing photos with filters and all that. That worked out so well that it managed to sell for $1 billion to Facebook. Another example of some major pivots is Flickr, which started out as an online multiplayer game. And somehow they evolved it and they changed their assumptions, they changed the product until it became what it is today, which is a photo sharing site. That's pretty dramatic. Started as an online multiplayer game and as a photo sharing site. Any other questions?
What I want to suggest to you guys is you'd like to tell Daniel what is your concept for your startup and perhaps ask for an idea how to apply lean startup methodology to your startup. If you'd like to, if you think that would be valuable to you.
I mean, I'll give that a try, but that might be very difficult because usually it takes about 10-15 minutes to understand somebody's startup well enough to suggest the right next steps. So we might be here for a while. But other questions? This is your last chance to ask me questions. After that, you have to send me an email.
Which are hard to get a reply.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to send 2 emails.
For starters.
No?
Okay.
All right, great. Well, it's been great to talk to you guys, and I hope this has been useful. It's been a pleasure to sort of share some of the knowledge, some of my experience from doing this for a few years in England. And I really hope that very soon you guys will have this going, have a nice startup community here. One of the things I really like about the startup community in general, it's in England, but also in the rest of the world, is that it's a very open community. People are very friendly, very sharing. They help each other a lot. There's typically if you approach somebody in the startup community and say, "Can you help me with this?" They will help you with this. They won't go and like try to somehow screw you along the way. There's also a very non-condescending outlook in the startup community. Usually, doesn't matter whether you're a junior developer who just started at some big startup, so it's basically somebody who's completely anonymous, or some big shot entrepreneur who just exited their company for 10 million. People will regard you in not exactly the same way, but they'll regard everybody with the understanding that that person who's right now a junior developer in some startup might next year be the founder of a really cool startup, and the following year be exiting for whatever. So it's a really great and useful community to have around, really helpful and really, really friendly. So hopefully you guys can build this here and make this happen. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.